Okay, well, why don't we begin? It's really a real privilege to welcome everybody to the inaugural conversation of this new venture, the Jewish Parents Forum. Before we get started with our panel and conversation, Rebecca, I wonder if you could just say a few words about how this idea got initiated, why we're doing it, what we're trying to accomplish here together.
Great, thanks, Eric. And thanks everyone for being here. And just special thanks to my friends Carolyn Rowan and Nina Renner-Davidson and Liz Lang, who worked with us on pulling this thing together. We've been working on it for a long time, had a lot of conversations. And a special thanks, of course, to Tikvah. I don't think there was any other organization that we would have gone to pull this together, to have this level of conversation, really, on this kind of program. I've been involved with Tikvah myself for very many years. I can say that they really helped me develop my sense of Jewish identity. And even more critically, really, they helped me understand that identity in the context of my other identity as an American and as a participant in Western civilization. And that's really a sweet spot for Tikvah, the nexus between those things. And I think all of us, talk about that and think about that. And we certainly think about it for our children. And so, this forum was developed really because of the moment. This is a moment for parents, of course, all around the country, a big moment. We're all grappling with a lot of different issues, culturally, educationally, and a lot of levels. As American Jewish parents, we, of course, add on to that list of challenges, a whole other host of challenges, things like anti-Semitism and BDS on campus and what's happening in our synagogues and all the things that many of you on this call whom I know, we sit around at dinner and complain about all the time. And so rather than just complain, we went to Eric Cohn and Carolyn Brick and the Tikvah gang and complained to them and said, we have to do more than just complain. We have to find a way to get parents together to talk about these issues, to define the problems, to strategically think about ways to fight them, defend against them, and to prepare our children, importantly, for whatever they're going to face, whether it's on campus or beyond. And ultimately, I guess it's also about helping all of us grow in our own sense of Jewish identity, help us develop that in our children. You fight for what you love. So we should all love being Jews. And when the fight's over one day, we hope, there'll be something left besides the fight for us to hand over to the next generation. So that's also very much a part of the agenda. And this forum, the next 5 weeks, and all the other things inside the umbrella of the Jewish Parents Forum, I think will help all of us to think together about all of these issues. And I hope everybody in this call will make suggestions and launch their complaints at Eric too, because it helps to build this thing and make it stronger. And so with that, I'm turning it back to you. And thank you very much, Eric, for this. We really appreciate it.
Well, Rebecca, thanks to you and to Liz and to Carolyn and Nina for pushing us to create this Jewish Parents Initiative. For those of you I don't know, I'm Eric Cohen. I've had the privilege to be the executive director of Tikvah for about 15 years now. And as Rebecca captured really quite elegantly, we are an educational institution that is built on three basic pillars: that Jewish culture, Jewish civilization is exceptional, that Israel is a heroic nation, and that America is a land of hope, both for the Jews and for the world. And our mission has been to try to transmit these ideas in a serious way, in a thoughtful way, in a wisdom-seeking way to young people, high school students, college students, young professionals, to get them to cherish their own Jewish and Zionist and American inheritance. And what we've noticed in the last number of years is an increasing sense of, I'd say, anxiety, concern, worry among parents of our students who have come to us looking for guidance and advice about how to make sure the curriculum in their schools is sound and teaching the things that they value, about where to go to college and how to flourish as confident Jews when their sons and daughters get to college, about how to think about navigating the current cultural environment as parents worried about their children. And I should say in this context, I'm here also as a parent. I have 4 young kids, as young as 4th grade. My oldest is in 11th grade, thinking with many of you about what the next steps are for them. And so we created this Parents Forum to bring parents together to think in a serious way about these issues and to link people to one another, including younger students to older students, kids in high school to established and successful college students who can pass down their own experiences in a practical and thoughtful way. We kicked off the public face of this initiative on Thursday night last week with an event on Jews heading off to college. And with very little marketing or effort, we had well over 1,000 people, families registered to engage in this conversation. And this series that we begin this afternoon is meant to go even deeper, to be a conversation among friends, to think about the big questions of the day that Jewish parents face. And so I can't think of any better duo here than Christine Rosen and Rabbi Meir Soloveichik to kick these conversations off. Both of them are columnists at Commentary Magazine. Christine has been a friend and fellow writer of mine for many, many years, really one of the most probing and thoughtful analysts of American culture in general. And over the last couple of years has written some of the most important essays about how do we think culturally in terms of what's going on for young people today. And so our thematic, which Christine will kick off, and then I will give Rabbi Soloveichik an appropriately elevated introduction here in a few minutes. But our thematic today is American culture good for young people? How do we think about that as Americans? How do we think about it as Jews? How do we think about it as Zionists? And so I thought, Christine, you could kick us off just thinking generally about the American cultural situation today and how it affects the young. And then Rabbi Soloveichik will turn it over to you to think a little bit more Jewishly about how to pass on what we think is important in terms of America and in terms of Israel to elementary, middle school, high school, and college students. So it's really a privilege to welcome both of you and to welcome everyone. Christine, I turn this over to you for the opening round here.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you, Rabbi. Thank you to Tikvah as well, because as Eric mentioned, I too am a parent of high schoolers. I'm struggling with these very same questions. I think about them often. So I really look forward to hearing from you all about the kinds of solutions and challenges that you're facing as well, because I think these conversations are the start of solving some of these problems. And to speak to what Rebecca said, I know we all sit around and worry, but actually taking action as she has organized this and as Tikvah is bringing us all together is the way forward. I'll start by saying I think we all feel like there's been a sort of perfect storm culturally as parents in the last year and a half. I mean, obviously the pandemic with school closures and disruptions and job loss and fear and general anxiety. But what a lot of that led to, I think, for many parents is a recognition that a lot of the cultural and social institutions to which we have entrusted our children and assumed had our children's best interests in mind proved not to have their best interests in mind, or proved instead to have taken the old cynical political maxim, never let a crisis go to waste. And instead of focusing on the needs of communities and families and children, focused on consolidating their power in the case of perhaps teachers' unions and schools, focused on promoting narratives about the history of this country and in terms of critical race theory and other more radical agendas in education. And for a lot of parents, and I include myself in this, that came as a bit of a shock. I think a lot of us felt taken aback by that. But what I think it also gave us was a recognition that perhaps we haven't been engaged enough in helping form those institutions and having our voices heard. And there's been a sort of miniature parents' revolt in various parts of the countries with regard to certainly to practical issues like reopening schools and safety matters with regard to COVID, but also about what is being taught in schools and what our kids are learning about the history of our country, its purpose, and their role as citizens. So broadly speaking, I think there are three areas in which, as parents and as people who value what this country stands for and value faith traditions, should focus on. The first is civics, and the way in which a lot of how we understand our role and the purpose of governance in this country has been radically altered. And free speech in particular, I think, is under threat. And so that's one thing that I think we need to look at as parents. Civility is the other. And when I talk about this with my high schoolers and their friends, they sort of giggle like, what's that? That's something out of a Jane Austen novel. No, it's actually something that's central to democracy being able to function. And we have a very powerful tool that accelerates the degeneration of civility called social media. And I think that's one aspect as parents that we need to be extremely aware can have both very positive impacts on kids if they know how to go about using it responsibly, but can also have very negative impacts on them. And finally, our institutions. I'll give you a little survey I came across the other day that startled me. The Pew Research Center did a survey about faith in institutions, and it broke people out by political affiliation, and it asked the general population and then broke it out by, progressive left, very conservative, slightly conservative, and whatnot. And what they found is that 71% of people who identified as progressive believed that most of our institutions need to be completely rebuilt because they're fundamentally biased and unfair. And that shocked me. That's a very radical, it's still a minority in the country, but it's a very radical way of understanding our institutions. 25% of the general population agrees with them. So this is not most of us. Most of us actually want to rebuild, repair, and work on our institutions as they are. But what I think we're often allowing ourselves in terms of education and cultural power to do is to let a very small and more radicalized minority of voices drown out the rest of us. And so finding ways in civil conversation, debate, discussion to do something about those institutions, either from the inside, if that's possible, or creating new institutions from the outside is really one of the things that I think is very important for us as parents to think about as our children get older and hopefully one day become leaders themselves in these institutions.
Christine, thanks for getting this conversation going, this kind of cultural diagnosis. We'll think together a little bit later about strategies and solutions. What could some of the answer to these challenges be? But Rabbi Soloveichik, I'd love to turn it over to you. I'm sure many of you now know Rabbi Soloveichik from Bible 365, his tour de force exploration of the entire Hebrew Bible in a year. I'm even shocked that we've allowed him out of the Bible 365 cell here for a few minutes to join us in this discussion. But Rabbi Soloveichik is one of the most prolific writers, thinkers, speakers in the Jewish world today, both at Yeshiva University, where he heads the Strauss Center, and is the senior rabbi of America's oldest congregation. Rabbi, I thought you could help us think a little bit as Jews about how to think about this cultural moment for our young people, and especially those of us who care about passing down in a positive way the American story and the Zionist story. What are the challenges we face, and how can we confront them, wisely and boldly?
Yeah, so thank you very much, and I'm excited to speak about the subject because it's near and dear to my heart. And I want to thank you for the introduction, the elevated introduction. I think it could have been a little more, there could have been slightly more elevation to it, but still, it was elevated enough for the needs of the time at the moment. I'm a parent with my wife of 6 children, and I have a deep and abiding love for the American story, and of course, also a deep and abiding love for the miracle that is the story of the Jewish people, both the modern Zionist story, but of course the entire story of the Jewish people from Abraham till today. And one of the things I think more than anything else, perhaps, is how to communicate what I care about, how to communicate to my children about these matters, about which I care very, very, very deeply. I want to argue something a little bit counterintuitive, maybe for a Tikvah discussion. And that is that, and it's counterintuitive because, of course, what Tikvah stands for, first and foremost, and what I do in my cell 24/6 on behalf of Tikvah is talk about ideas. We stand for ideas, we stand for the power of ideas and for the importance of ideas, importance of Jewish ideas, importance of political ideas, and so forth. But when it comes to children, I want to begin by arguing that perhaps ideas are not enough. The act of learning is not enough. Reading is not enough. And even teaching is not enough. And in order to illustrate what I mean, I want to give as an example one of the most celebrated of Jewish ceremonies, which is something that we're all familiar with, and that is the Seder. The Seder, when we think about it, is, of course, an act of covenantal transmission, an act of teaching. But it is first and foremost an event about emotion, imagination. It is about reliving an experience. Children do not merely study children look forward to the Seder precisely because it's different than a regular study session, because it is an experience and it fires the imagination. It is a time when we speak of something that should be preposterous. We are remembering leaving Egypt, even though, of course, we were born millennia after Israel left Egypt. But we do so by reliving and re-experiencing and reimagining those events. Now, what's fascinating is that, I think Rabbi Sachs was the one who pointed this out first, is that it's precisely on the eve of the Exodus, right as they're about to leave and as they're leaving, that Moses does something himself extraordinarily counterintuitive. He doesn't say, okay, we're leaving now, and now we're founding God's nation, and here are all the laws, and here are all the ideas that we stand for. And they're going to get to that. They're going to get to Sinai, and they're going to take care of it. But he doesn't do that first. So the first thing he does is he says, and here's how you're going to remember these events and allow your children to re-experience them. They haven't even left yet. And he's saying, later, next year, in the future, when your children ask you, why are you doing this? Why are you eating this matzah? And so on and so forth. And you will tell him as you're doing it, because this is what God did for me as we left Egypt. And basically what's being said is that if we really want to fire our children's commitment, then they have to be bound to this heart and soul. And then, of course, as they grow older, as they mature, they could then be motivated to learn more profoundly about the ideas that they represent. And so I think when it comes to teaching our children about the story of hope that is the American story, when it comes to teaching our children about the Zionist miracle, both stories which are under attack to this day, it is of course enormously important to focus on the history of these tales and to teach ultimately our children all the facts of what occurred. But it's not enough. It's not enough. You have to think, as it were, of teaching history and teaching the American story and the Jewish story as a constant series of seders in which parents need to be involved. We'll start with America. So something that we try to do is to take our children to all of the central places and sites that were formative in the American story. And we don't just make it about a school trip. We take our kids to Philadelphia. We take them to Independence Hall, and we speak about what the Declaration was. And obviously we tell them about the treasure map on the back of the Declaration of Independence, obviously, as well, which is not our focus for today, but still an important fact in its own right. But we do it in a way, hopefully, that allows them to re-experience the story. So America is under attack today because people have focused on terrible sins in the American past, which are indeed part of the American past, and transform that into the essence of America itself, rather than approaching in the opposite way, which is a story of a country that proclaimed a great and universal idea, that then fought for the advancement and expansion of that very idea. So I could teach my children about it, you could teach your children about it, but nothing will compare it to taking your children to Gettysburg and having them stand on Little Round Top and tell them about, the 20th of Maine, one regiment or battalion or whatever, on which the entire battle and the entire Civil War may have turned, and having them stand there and experience it. Or taking your kids on segways, which I did through Gettysburg. That you would probably need somebody with a little more coordination than myself, because I did run into a tree branch and was thrown off my Segway and skinned my arm, though that does allow me to tell people from now on that I was injured at Gettysburg, which is something I really do like to say. And obviously the world will little forget what I said there, but they can never forget what I did there. But that said, nothing can compare to that. And the same thing, of course, is for the story of Israel. When we talk about modern Israel, or something that I'll talk about in Bible 365 all the time, which is the miracle of the Jewish story as well. You can teach your children the story of Israel. You could teach them the story of Zionism. And ultimately we must. And Tikvah will offer any number of courses for your children in high school age and in elementary and in middle school age. Very important ones about the Zionist story and the American story. But can that compare to taking your children to the city of David and having them place in your child's hand ashes from the Second Temple that were there from when Jerusalem was originally burned, and to stand and hold those ashes from 2,000 years ago in their hands, and then look out at the same time and see a Jerusalem rebuilt. Nothing can compare to that experience. And so I would only add to what we've been saying before, that the realm of ideas is essential. Building institutions is essential. Fighting back within the institutions that our children are essential, but it's not sufficient. And that ultimately, if we know what the power of a Pesach Seder or a Passover Seder can be, we need to think about what it means to fire our children's emotions, and to bind them thereby, both to the American story and to the Jewish story.
Rabbi Soloveichik, thank you. In a minute, we'll begin taking some questions from all of you. And the best way to do that is just type in the things you want to explore more deeply into the Q&A, and we'll field and moderate those questions. But I wanted to come back with the question of, okay, what should we do? Meaning, if we have this sense that some of our educational institutions are not transmitting both the ideas and the deeper attachments to the American story rightly understood, to the Zionist story rightly understood, to the Jewish story richly understood, what are our options? And it seems to me, to simplify, there are three kinds of options. One is to fight, meaning to try to push back from within those institutions to stand up for better visions of what a good education ought to look like. The second is to supplement, which is to say, to try to create experiences, other kinds of educational opportunities, whether ideas driven or experience driven, that arm those young people better, even though they're going to go through the existing institutions, imperfect as they are. And the third is to build entirely new institutions, to build new schools, to build new colleges. Just last week, there was a big public announcement about the University of Austin, a new founding of a new kind of college. And so I'm curious, Christine, and then Rabbi Soloveichik, how do you evaluate and assess those three strategies? Fight, supplement, build anew.
That's a great question. And I think I would answer, you have to do of all three, which sounds like it's a lot, but in fact, so the fighting, I think, is right now for a lot of folks who have older kids in particular, who have come through an institution, have a lot of ties, who have friendships, who have connection to it. Fighting back is important in the sense that it puts on notice what is, in many cases, again, a very small group who have captured or co-opted the institution or are enforcing on the institution a message that perhaps the general parent and community in general doesn't support. And I think for a very long time, and I blame parents, I blame myself and my kids' own schooling for this, we didn't speak up. We, you know, as Rebecca said, we can complain in private, but we didn't speak up in public. And I spent a lot of last year speaking up in public meetings. My kids are in public school in DC, and just really being a thorn in the side of administrators who refuse to be held accountable to parents. And it was a very nerve-wracking experience. I was worried about what it would expose my children to in terms of what their peers would say. But at the end of the day, it did, you know, it brought other parents together. We organized, we actually did have an impact, however small. So that part, I think, in the immediate term, particularly with regard to curriculum, is very important. And we've seen how parents in school systems in Virginia, for example, basically turned the tide of an election because they refused to stop talking about what was bothering them. They refused to stand down. They showed up at meetings. They just turned up and said, it's enough. And that really was galvanizing, I think, for a lot of parents who might think, oh, I don't have time to do that. I have so many other things I'm doing. I'm not that kind of person. I'm not a fighter. I don't go to protests. Well, you might have to become that kind of person if you care about your child having an affiliation attachment to the institution. For younger kids, I think you do make a calculation. I have many friends who've done this, where you kind of cut your losses with an institution that is not responding to those concerns of parents, and you build a new one, or you take them to a different institution. It's more of a challenge. Certainly building something from scratch is always a challenge, but as you mentioned, Eric, you know, people are trying to do this. They're making the effort. So I'm a fan of fighting. I never thought I'd say that. I'm not that kind of parent. I'm not, but I've kind of been galvanized to become one because I care deeply about what lessons my kids are learning. And I also care about their peers. These are the people who they're going to grow up and marry and have kids with themselves. And I think their right to free speech and their right to intelligent debate and their right not to be misinformed is something they are owed by us. We need to protect that right for them. So I guess I come down on fighting. Building institutions long-term is a better solution, but much more of a challenge.
Rabbi, what would you say? Fight,
Yeah,
supplement, or build anew?
I think all are essential, as Christine said. I would just add a fourth one, though it may fit into supplement, but by supplement, by supplement we mean supplementing on behalf of the parents, which I think, as I said before, is one of the most critical things that is out there. But I think one of the other challenges we face is not merely what our children experience within the realm of the academy, within the institutions of which they are a part, but what they are experiencing from the larger culture. And the culture itself, popular culture to which they are exposed, is now also something that is fully a part of the Great Awakening, and its culture to some extent is even more important and influential than education itself. Not that education is important, and so I think we need to ask ourselves first, what are our children experiencing culturally out there? And second, when it comes to building, not only can we build institutions, and you mentioned building a new university in Austin and so forth, but what sort of cultural products can be created? You know, it's interesting, the massive success of Hamilton a couple of years ago, which is in its own way deeply in love with the American story and the American experience. The huge success of it highlighted, I think, a real hunger for genuinely patriotic cultural experiences, not denying America's flaws and issues and sins, but nevertheless. And I'm not so sure if Hamilton could or would be made the same way. And I'm not the first one to comment this. After the last 3 years, if Hamilton was being created right now, if it would be made, or if it would be made in the same way. And so on the one hand, we have this sign that there is a deep hunger for cultural experiences that touch something meaningful within us. That's true as far as civically, that's true civically. And I give other examples, especially from what's being successful in Israel. I think that's true Jewishly. Israel has any number of fascinating phenomena now where there are cultural products that are crossing religious secular lines in a way that I can't find here in America. And the success there in Israel shows again that there really is this hunger for experiencing in music or in movies or in television or something or other art forms of artistic expression. Something that touches our hearts and our souls. And so I would agree that all three are important, but I think the future of culture and the culture our children experience is as important, if not more important than all of those three.
So in a minute, I want to begin taking some questions from the larger group, but I just share one thought and see what you guys think before we open it up. But please, I encourage everyone to start, if they do have questions, just start typing them into the Q&A box. It seems to me that American Jews actually have a unique role to play in these debates, that we're not just another subpopulation. And I mean that in two different ways. First is sometimes said, Jews are sort of the canary in the coal mine. I mean, there's a way in which, the anti-Zionist movements on campus, the so-called intersectionality, which is irrationally singled out Israel and people that have an attachment to Israel, was like the forward spear, so to speak, of some of these movements that have really begun to corrupt American education more broadly. And in reverse, I would say Jews can give unique voice to the greatness of the American experiment, and all that America has done unlike any other diaspora in Jewish history, to make room for America. And so I'm curious if you think there's something to the idea that as a Jewish parents forum in embryo, meaning something that we're beginning to create, that not only is this about how do we educate and protect our Jewish kids, but how do Jews make a contribution as Jews to the American situation culturally today? You think there's anything to that suggestion?
Yeah, I
Rabbi?
mean, sure. Of course I do. So many of the courses and lectures that I've done for Tikvah have had that as a theme, which is the Jewish gratitude that we owe to America and the uniqueness of the Jewish experience in America as itself one of the greatest historical expressions of the blessings that are America. The question becomes, that's a reason why we need to feel gratitude to America. Whether American Jewry is feeling that or not is a separate question, but we definitely should feel that gratitude. The question, though, is how can we then use our own experience to somehow transform the country, or impact at least positively the country for the better? That is a much harder question. We can share the uniqueness of our own story. I do that all the time in both Jewish and non-Jewish audiences. But and I can tell you so many different reasons why Jews need to be grateful to America. But the question is then, all right, so then now the greatness of America is being challenged. So we certainly have an obligation, but what is our unique contribution that we will do? That's a much harder question. That's a much harder question. And there, I think we can do two things. We can work, and we should work, to highlight the different ways in which Jewish ideas have impacted America in general. And I think that's important from an education perspective. But I think also it's just our obligation to create connections with parents that I've met from across the country who are not Jewish, who are struggling with the same issues. And what we have to share there is not our unique Jewish experience, but our shared love of the American story. There are parents all across the country that are raising the same questions that we have here today. These could be Catholic parents in Indiana, or Mormon parents in Utah, or Jews across the country who are concerned about this. And at the moment, there is nothing connecting them. There is no shared resources that we have. It is, where would I go if we wanted to teach our children about it? You know, your teacher and mine, Eric, Leon Cass, along with his late wife, Amy, had this wonderful project, What So Proudly We Hail, which provided some readings for engaging and studying the American story. And I think that's still up there, and that's a wonderful start. But much more needs to be done. And there needs to be resources that would provide both cultural experiences as well as texts and so much more for parents across the country who want to teach their children about that. And then, of course, for Jews, one can repeat that in the Zionist when it comes to Israel and Zionism as well.
I would add as well that there's an opportunity here for well-informed parents to make sure that they're teaching both their kids and challenging their own institutions, whether these are religious institutions or educational institutions, about anti-Semitism as it is expressed in the progressive activist class right now. So, for example, the Sunrise Movement, which was saying horribly anti-Semitic things and, you know, wouldn't allow anyone who had any affiliation with Israel to march in their progressive movements. The Women's March some years ago was denying, you know, women who wanted to walk with a flag, an Israeli flag, as part of the progressive movement. They were denied that. They were called white adjacent. They were told that they weren't on the scale of intersectional grievance. They were, you know, because the argument made by folks who were saying this was that, well, Jews are successful, so we can't really, you know, we don't have anything to say to them. But actually, a lot of that was just a veil for anti-Semitism. So there's really much more emboldened anti-Semitic expressions among the progressive activist class now. And I do think that when institutions kind of uncritically embrace, they're like, oh, we're against global warming, we want climate change, and they start partnering with groups like Sunrise Movement, not realizing that embedded in those activist organizations and embedded in some of the ideology of these groups is blatant anti-Semitism. And I think a lot of it is just ignorance, not realizing that these debates have gone on. I have progressive friends who were very proud marchers in the Women's March, having had no idea that some of the central organizers were expelled from the movement by others because they were Jewish women. So these sorts of things, it's incumbent on those of us who are involved in institutions to educate ourselves about the activist groups and the messages that we are sometimes uncritically embracing because we want to seem open and progressive and, advancing racial or environmental causes. I think that happens with not a lot of deep dive into what the animating beliefs of these organizations often are.
So I want to move now to taking some questions from the larger group. I'll just add to this that I think this is where Jews can really help drive home the distinction between having a strong and meaningful identity versus identity politics. I mean, Rebecca began this discussion by talking about how important her own Jewish identity is. And I think that's something all of us, who are trying to pass that down to our children care about. We want our sons and daughters to have deep Jewish attachments, even as Americans. Having a deep identity as a Jew is different than trafficking in grievance. It's different than seeing people as only parts of a tribe based on their skin color. And I think we can show what that looks like. Having strong communal institutions, a sense of our own heritage, our own distinctive way of life, our own culture, our own inheritance as Jews on the one hand, but never giving in to the sort of identity politics grievance mentality, which is so pernicious and is so central to what is eroding the educational quality of our institutions today. So I think if Jews can get that right, we might be, and to take an old Jewish trope, a model to the nations or a light to the nations in how to have an identity without succumbing to identity politics. So it's now my privilege to welcome on stage, or the virtual stage, my friend and colleague, Caroline Brick. Caroline, you're there, I hope. Going once, going twice, here we go. Caroline has just joined Tikvah as a colleague to really help spearhead as executive director this Jewish Parents Initiative. I mean, this is something that we really want to throw serious institutional weight and energy into, and she comes at this, with a strong educational background, a background in the world of ideas, been a teacher herself, and also as a parent, concerned like we are about building a stronger future, Zionist future, Jewish future, American future for our young people today. So Caroline, it's great to welcome you to Tikvah and to have you as a partner in building this initiative, and to now to turn to you for the very high-tech job here of moderating this Q&A.
Thank you, Eric, and it's been an honor to work with all of you on this. We'll start with a question from Rebecca Sugar. It's actually a series of questions. Jews have been fighting anti-Israel rhetoric in the culture for some time. Are we winning? Falling further behind? Do we understand the problem and the cultural movements that have produced it? Are we being strategic in addressing it? Are our efforts actually contributing to the problem?
Rabbi, you want the first cut on that one?
Yes, no, yeah. I think when it comes to the question of Israel and the world, obviously there's both great achievements and there's also a lot to be distressed about. And so the question is, what are we talking about and where? As far as the expansion of groups, countries that have embraced Israel, we've seen some wondrous things in the past 2-3 years. Things that, if I had told you 10 years ago would occur, I don't think we would see it. And we see achievements by Israel and in its reach in science and technology and how it's helping the world in terms of water technology and so forth. That has led to it being embraced by countries around the world. And on that aspect, the attempts of, let's say, BDS to limit Israel's impact in the world, I think in that respect, I think there's a terrible failure. In terms of the ongoing progression of anti-Israel rhetoric within the academy and within the left, it's hard to deny that the battle is being lost, and that it's growing ever wide, even within political institutions where by and large anti-Israel rhetoric is not the norm. Those who engage in it are tolerated and even times celebrated in a way that they would not be if they were expressing animus toward any other group. So it seems obvious that in that respect we are losing. There's an enormous amount to celebrate, and there's an enormous amount to be concerned about, an enormous amount of regression as well. I'm intrigued by Rebecca's statement of, are we doing the wrong things? And I'd love, in other words, so to me, that's, I think that was the final sentence, something like that, Caroline, meaning, and I'm intrigued by that question. I would love to know what she means by that, meaning, is there something that's being done in the, let's say, in pro-Israel activism that she thinks is counterproductive? Because I'd love to, I'd be interested in hearing about that. That I don't know enough to say, but I do think that we have to both be enormously worried as well as enormously inspired. And I think it's important to recognize that even as the anti-Israel movement is making inroads in certain parts of America, there are many, many, many tens of millions of Americans who care deeply about Israel. And that's something that's never happened in the history of diaspora Judaism, where something like that could be experienced. That there are, just based on numbers, more non-Jews than Jews who care deeply about the future of the Jewish people and of the Jewish state. That's something that's never happened before. So we need to be worried about what there is to be worried about, and we need to fight smartly and prudentially. But we also live in an age of wonders and miracles. We really do, and we need to recognize that as well.
Can I just add to that, because my day job involves thinking a lot about politics. One of the platforms on which we see a lot of this stuff play out nowadays is on social media. And so, for example, one of the worries I have is the way in which anti-Semitic statements are normalized on platforms of that scale and size, because anger and hostility and provocation is rewarded by the platform. But then you see elected officials who actually are, sort of performing on these platforms. I'm thinking here of the Squad, for example, and members of this, progressive group of elected representatives will say absolutely appalling things. Now, on the one hand, you can, people fight back on social media, point this out, and it becomes an issue. But I've so far been very disappointed that that kind of public pressure that's brought to bear doesn't generally lead to consequences for those actions in the real world of, their leaders, chastising them. It becomes a scandal, but in some ways, because it all plays out on social media, it doesn't feel like there's real justified action to stop it, right? So I wonder, I think social media is one of the areas where this stuff plays out and we feel like we're doing something, but in the end, have we moved the ball forward at all in combating this kind of anti-Semitism? I'm not sure. I'd be curious to hear what our audience thinks.
Okay, hard question. Caroline, should we take another one?
Yes, we'll take another one, and I encourage you all to submit questions. This one comes from Anonymous. How do you push back in the sphere of religious institutions? The reform movement as a whole is parroting the secular trends and doing damage to both Jewish identity and the love of our country. Movements that represent a majority of Jews and altering the course of the narrative.
Rabbi, you want that one?
I don't have a worked out strategy. for pushing back within the reform movement but I do think that, as with any other institution, it is, as Christine said before, important to fight and important to take a stand. But ultimately, as I said before, it will fall to the parents to introduce their children to the right and the good. That's unfortunately the situation in which we find ourselves, where many different institutions are not doing what they're supposed to be doing for whatever reason, and there's a variety of reasons. That doesn't mean this should all be on the parents. It's important for organizations like Tikvah and others to provide the resources and the experiences that parents of which the parents can avail themselves. But the hard truth is that in the face of institutions which may be failing in how our country is spoken of and how the Jewish people is spoken of, how the Jewish state is spoken of, it will fall to the parents to seek. Fighting is important, but fighting takes time and transforming takes time. Whereas the years of our children are finite and critical. And it will fall to the parents to provide those experiences that are not being provided by the institutions that are failing them. I think that's important. I'd like to volunteer, Caroline, by the way, if the new group wants to do a trip to Gettysburg, I would be happy to lead this trip, and would even go
to sign a waiver for the segue.
I would about to say I would even go on the segue again. I would be willing to do that for the cause. And I do a pretty great Civil War.
I don't know if Tikvah has a big enough insurance policy here to cover you. Plus, you should be at home writing Bible 365. You don't get to go.
Wait a minute, you're going to let me come home? This is huge. This
is
being recorded, right?
I take it back. Look, just to weigh in briefly on this question myself, I would say two things. I think this is a kind of mugged by reality moment for many Jewish institutions, and it's a time for choosing. We in America have allowed, in a healthy sense, a variety of forms of Jewish life to flourish. But there are certain, I think, lines of Jewish attachment and Zionist attachment that have to be sustained and drawn. And I think, if there are Jews who are going to synagogues and temples where some of their own core values as Jews, or some of their own core attachments as Americans, or some of their own deep connections to Israel are constantly and relentlessly being challenged, they're going to look for different spiritual homes as Jews. And I think these institutions are going to have to, make a choice, because I think what's been going on with their young people is actually, I think, having a self-reflective effect on parents thinking about their own Jewish and Zionist lives. The second thing that I'll mention is that, Tikvah had never tried until COVID hit to work with younger students. And when COVID hit, I sort of looked down the hall and I had a 7th grader and a 9th grader, and they had time on their hands. I'll put it that way. And we thought, what an opportunity to turn this crisis on its head and to try to bring them opportunities for Jewish and Zionist and American learning online, if we could make it work. And we've been amazed at the hunger among these 7th and 8th grade kids. And it was through a generous strategic grant from the Millstone family, a couple of other foundations. We've actually begun a whole strategy of trying to find 7th and 8th grade students around the country. Those young people who are actually open to ideas and open to richer experiences, and give them the kind of Hebrew school education they haven't been getting. And the Hebrew school model has been a mixed bag at best in America and a tragic failure at worst. But the problem is not the tradition. The problem is not the richness of Jewish life and experience. The problem is taking these young people seriously and offering them the real thing in ways that are exciting to them. And the Jewish story is an exciting, heroic story. I think Bible 365 is one model of bringing that to life. We've begun thinking about how do we take some of the ideas of Bible 365 and make them relevant to young people. So I think coming up with new models, this gets to the sort of, fight, supplement, or build. Well, in the spirit of supplement and build, I think turning the bar mitzvah into something rich and meaningful, and then giving parents the kind of courage and the confidence to build their own networks of Jewish life and learning. I think the disruption of COVID has opened up a lot of new ways of thinking that could end up having positive long-term effects, for our young people. And this is maybe, Christine, the inverse of social media. For all the negatives, there is an opportunity here, don't you think?
I do. In fact, I just finished teaching a 5-week course for Tikvah for 7th and 8th graders about the ethics of social media. And the kids were amazing. They came from all over the country, and we did it on Zoom, which I was worried about. But in fact, they came eager to participate, and they brought both their own faith experiences and their own social experiences, and they discussed differences amongst themselves in seminar style. I learned a great deal about how they navigate social media use, how, their Jewish identity, the questions they ask before expressing it online, and what their concerns are among their peer groups, and sort of, we talked about mob justice, these sorts of things. It was extremely helpful, I think, to them to have a forum that was separate from their educational institutions, with a group of peers who aren't the ones they go to school with all day, every day, not their immediate social circle, but their same age range and same interests, to just discuss this in a very open environment where there wasn't a lot of fear about saying the wrong thing or being thought one way or the other. And it was fascinating. The discussions were amazing. They're just impressive kids. And it really was a perfect hybrid of using the technology and the tools to improve their own use of social media, because they all use social, most of them do use social media, and to get them thinking about that in a critical way, both to reinforce their own sense of themselves as Americans, as Jews, and just as young people in this country at this particular moment, which is deeply confusing to many of them as well. So it was, for me, who's a social media skeptic, it was a great education in seeing how kids are using it for good, as well as, some of the challenges they face in their use of it.
Christine, you mentioned earlier the importance of civility. Do you think that's, something that can be renewed and taught to young people today? And why do you think civility is so important in, building a strong educational culture for American kids today?
This is going to sound terrible, but we older folks have actually taught by poor example, not the people in the Zoom chat, but an older generation has taught by poor example the younger generation the importance of civility, because they watch the adults in the world sniping at each other on Twitter and arguing in ways that, they've been taught since birth not to speak to others that way. And they see adults behaving that way and they don't like it. Many of them are thinking that's not productive, right? So I think in some ways the kids who are growing up in this world where arguments are ambient all the time on social media can be guided to think about civility as something that's a core value for democratic deliberation. They get their politics from various sources and whatnot, but when the way that they speak to their teachers, for example, the way that they have discussions and debates amongst their peers when they are face-to-face versus online, these are new habits that we need to help teach them. And it's not always possible for parents, especially with middle schoolers and high schoolers who are in their healthy rebellious phase. It's not always possible to hear it from their parents and listen in the same way. So having these sorts of opportunities where they can see civility in action, both modeled by the adults in their lives, but also modeled by their peers, to give them, I hate to use this phrase, I use it ironically, but giving them safe spaces where they can practice civility and they can practice having debates about very difficult issues while still respecting the other person's right to disagree without hating the other person, without demonizing the other person, because that, I think, is unfortunately in adult political culture too much the norm.
Rabbi, any thoughts on the Jewish approach to civility here?
Well, you're touching
an oxymoron.
No, well, it's funny you say that, because it's actually touching on one of my favorite sermon references of all time, which is there's a wonderful book about civility called Civility by Stephen Carter. who's an African-American professor at Yale, who, when you first read it, you see that he's mentioning all these different Jewish sources, like actual halachic sources. And you're wondering, like, why is he so interested in Judaism? What's going on here? And he's quoting like really like Sfarim, like halachic books that I myself didn't know about. And then you find out as you read the book that there was this that when he was a young boy, his family moved to a largely white neighborhood in suburban Virginia and suburban Washington, Virginia, and there was a Jewish woman who lived next door by the name of Sarah Kestenbaum, who came over with cream cheese and jelly sandwiches and offered them to him and his family. And he says something like, and to this day, I could still feel the smooth, slick sweetness of the cream cheese and jelly sandwiches when I realized how one small, unassuming act of civility can change a life forever. And then he devoted this entire book to describing, to actually thinking about what it means to argue with civility. And it's really worth seeing now. He wrote this in the 90s, so this is before social media, and so it's worth rereading because what he's giving us really is a theology of civility, what it means, and he describes. And this is also very relevant to what's being debated today, because part of what he was talking about is how those like Martin Luther King engaged in, even when it was in civil disobedience, did so with civility, even in the face of those who were really quite hateful. And that was actually something, and he describes why that was so central to what King stood for. And he describes that. It's a book from the 1990s that is far more relevant to today. And it's also, as an aside, I recommend it to everybody, but I also recommend it because he thanks in his foreword one student who he says he learned a lot from in his school. And that's Leah Klein, and that's my wife that he thanks in the book. And so it's, I'll just throw it as an aside. And also I'll add that when I had wanted to go out with my wife, and so I noticed that she had been thanked. So when I met her, I acted as if like I was like, I just heard her name for the first time. And I was like, oh, Stephen Carter thanks you in his foreword, right? And she was like impressed, like, wow, you actually remember who thanks who in forewords. It's really amazing. And that was maybe the smoothest thing I've ever done in my life. So I'm just sharing everybody that amazing story. But the greatest, if the book to really rediscover that is that book, Civility. And it's one of the best studies about the virtue that I've ever seen.
The smoothness is Leah Lisa making you think that you were smooth.
Yeah, well,
Let's just be honest
sure.
about this here. Okay, Carolyn, why don't we take one more question from the
Yeah.
group, and then, we've got a couple minutes and we will bring our conversation to closure.
Sure. This comes from Michal Amir Salkin. How do we reach out to those quote unquote just Jews who do not consider themselves to be a part of a unique ethnic group outside of the white box and who do not recognize the risk we and they face?
Rabbi?
That's a very hard question, how we do that. I think that the best that we can do is to model in our own lives and in the communities that we build what we think Judaism stands for. The power of impacting the unconnected is something that we take for granted, I think, at times. And I don't just mean that, obviously there should be some larger strategy, but I just mean in the way we live our own lives. Eric spoke about before eloquently about being proud of who you are without becoming part of the grievance culture. And I think if we do that well, then it can be so refreshing and hopefully even inspiring that we can draw others to us. But I think that is the only way. Obviously, there are ways of reaching or getting our message out there in articles and in books and so forth. But to those that are have already closed themselves out, the best way we can do it is by modeling something ourselves. And that really makes all of us, I think, central to addressing that problem. Every one of us has to be a messenger of Judaism in our own lives. Not that we should all be speaking about Torah all the time, and not that every one of us should be doing a daily podcast on the Bible. Believe me, you don't want to be doing that. But the fact is, it's exhausting. I'm just going to say it's exhausting. But the fact is, the power to impact our coworkers, our friends, anyone we meet. I can give you 10 stories where that's true, where that is happening. And that's just from my own experience and my own friends. Every single one of us plays an enormous role in that endeavor.
And if I could just add to something Rabbi said earlier about encouraging experiences outside of the institutions that parents can do, but I think also religious institutions can do, Jewish institutions can do, which is to promote free speech, free thought, debate, deliberation, invite the people who you disagree with into your institutions to have those kinds of debates and discussions in a civil fashion. That is modeling a behavior that unfortunately nowadays, with deplatforming people who we disagree with, or all of the sort of tendentious arguments against free speech, it's more important than ever to provide platforms for just those kinds of debates, because I think particularly for kids, they don't see enough of that. They don't see enough of that kind of wrestling with important ideas that have implications for their everyday lives.
Well, look, I want to thank both of you for a very, very rich and probing and serious discussion. And really, for us, the perfect way to begin a set of conversations as Jewish parents thinking about the culture today, thinking about what we want to hand down to our own sons and daughters, but the contribution we want to make as Jews to the educational debates, swirling around us. To just say a very, very brief word on what's next for us, in this venture, I would highlight just 4 things. First is we want to continue conversations like this, making it a smaller private group, off the record, high-level discussions. And so our next gathering will be with Dara Horn, one of the most interesting novelists in America today, someone who also happens to have a PhD in Yiddish literature, and whose very provocative book, People Love Dead Jews, has been one of the most discussed books in the Jewish world today. And she's thought very deeply about how do we bring education to life for young people through literature, through culture. And so we'll be in touch with you soon about that event with Dara, which will be in early January. The second is we want to really make a special effort to help families, who are thinking about college, make wise decisions for their 11th and 12th graders as they go through that process. That was the spirit of the event we did last week. But beyond a series of larger public events that we'll do, we have a network of really exceptional college students at, 60 or 70 of the leading colleges in the country, as well as professors and rabbis and other people on these campuses. They are there to be advisors to you or to people that to your sons, your daughters, their classmates. We want to make that network, that Tikvah network, available so that when you're thinking about this school or that school or this program or that program, or what is Orthodox life like, or Reform life like on this campus, we have people that can speak to you thoughtfully and from the inside about college life today. We think that's a part of being a community, is handing down some of that practical knowledge. We want to be able to do that. Third is we continue to extend rapidly the kinds of learning opportunities like the course that Christine Rosen taught. We've got 60 or so seminars going on right now for young people at different age groups. And what we want to do is not only to continue to extend that to kids for middle school and high school and gap year and college, we want to also open it up to parents. We want to offer more chances for parents to learn alongside their sons and daughters in their own classes on topics that are of interest to them. But one of the things we've heard from parents is that we'd love to have classes like the ones our kids are enrolled in. Can you offer more? We want to try to do that. And then the final thing that I'd like to see the Jewish Parents Forum think about in a very practical way is the whole question of school accountability. Meaning, we need to be able to hold schools accountable when they go down bad directions, whether that's in how they're teaching America, or whether that's how they're bringing identity politics in a classroom, or whether it's the soft acceptance of anti-Semitism in courses and how they're framing things. And we want to try to be a source of ideas and arguments and strength for parents who are not only fighting against problems in their schools, but in a positive way want to bring Jewish and American excellence into their schools. And, we've been at this educational effort for many, many years. If we can help distill some of that wisdom and experience, often hard won, to parents who want to bring it into their own institutions, we hope that'll serve a useful purpose. So those are some of the nascent aims of this effort. And we are living in a moment where the educational debate is now at the center of our lives. And we hope that as Jews, we can bring something meaningful to it. So I'm incredibly grateful, Christine and Rabbi Soloveichik, for helping kick off this discussion. Obviously to Rebecca Sugar, to Liz Lang, to Carolyn Rowan, to Nina Davidson for pushing us to start this initiative. And to Carolyn Brick, who will be working with us to move this hopefully from strength to strength. So I'm grateful to everybody who tuned in. I hope you benefited as much from the discussion as I did, and we will be in touch about future gatherings. So with that, we adjourn. Thanks to everybody. Stay well.
Thank you.